Hello, and welcome to Books in the World, a presentation of the Cape Cod Writers Center. I'm Ray Cormier, and I'm your host today for what I think will be a pretty special episode of this long-running program. And that's because my guest is William Martin, one of New England's most prolific and successful novelists, one with a truly national following. For decades, Bill has been bringing to life the American experience, from the refugees on the Mayflower, to the creation of the Constitution, to the death of Lincoln, and much more. And now he recently published his 11th novel, Bound for Gold. It's the 6th in his Peter Fallon series of historical novels, and it's an action-packed thriller that brings to life vividly the wild days of the California gold rush. Thanks for visiting us on the Cape, Bill.
I'm glad to be here, Ray.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm good, thank
Good.
you. Of course, this is an area you're very familiar with.
Yes.
Not least because of the work you did for your epic novel, Cape Cod.
That's right.
Which was just republished this year, I believe.
Well, it wasn't that it was republished. It's never been out, Cape Cod has never been out of print since 1991 when it first appeared. And the publishers this year decided, however, that they would bring it back in a nice new trade paperback edition, so that it's larger, the print is larger, and it has a new cover. If you haven't bought it yet, you should buy it, and if you have it in the old cover, you need the new cover. That's what I always say. And most of the homes on Cape Cod will have that book somewhere in the bookshelf. And it's always been a great satisfaction to me that Cape Cod has lived as long as it has. From the days when I first started seeing hardcover copies of the book with the ink drained out of the spine, because people have been holding the book on a wet bathing suit while they read it. Those are the experiences that a writer is always happy about. Yeah. But then the whole process of writing Cape Cod was a wonderful one, and I was able to do a lot of great research there. And now in Bound for Gold, I was able to do a lot of great research by going to California.
So how much time do you actually spend out on the Cape now?
Oh, well, I'll be here on and off whenever I get the end to go out in my boat, which is the floating definition now of the line from Jaws, we're going to need a bigger boat, because it's a 17-foot whaler, and based upon the news reports that I'm reading and the rumors that I'm hearing, there are 17-foot sharks out there in the bay now. Yes. So I'm a little bit less willing to jump off the boat and go for a swim.
Well, almost all your books have New England ties. And I know you went to Harvard, and you've been living in the Boston area for many years, but
Yep.
are you a native New Englander?
Yeah, I was born in Boston, grew up here. We moved to California in 1974 when I went to the USC Film School, which is where Bound for Gold was born back in those years. And after 4.5 years, I decided I wanted to live back in New England. And so my wife and I came home, and we've been here ever since.
Wow,
but California had its revenge upon me. Both of my sons now live out there.
And this is your 6th book about Peter Fallon.
Yeah.
The rare book expert and his on-again, off-again girlfriend.
Right.
Evangeline Carrington. Great name.
Yeah, that's true. Peter Fallon made his appearance in Back Bay, the first book. He and I were both in our late 20s at that point. And then he did not come back until a book called Harvard Yard in 2003. And he's become, since then, the character that provides us with a guide through history. So we've gone through the history of Harvard, and then in the Lost Constitution, we saw the growth of New England. And now here we are doing the history of one of the most significant events in American history, really, which is the California Gold Rush. Between the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and the beginning of the Civil War, there is nothing more impactful upon American history than the gold rush. And it's something that people sometimes forget. It's the moment when we really come to realize that people in the society in the East can break out of whatever bonds they have been held by in the East, and they can go far out to the West, and if they're lucky enough, and if they are hard-working enough, they too can get rich.
Right.
And so the American dream is really, I mean, there's always been an American dream, and it evolves. You can see it evolve in my work from
Right.
when the Pilgrims arrive here and drop anchor in Provincetown Harbor and say, we will build a religious community here. We will plant God's seeds here, even though there are people running around in the woods who think that God is here already, namely the Wampanoag people. From that part of history, through the evolution of into the American Revolution, out to the history of California, you see a change in how we view ourselves and what we view as the real purpose of an American Revolution, from the theocracy that the Pilgrims envisioned to get rich quick,
Right.
make that money, and find that gold out in California.
So this is sort of the start of the modern capitalistic American
It
dream,
is.
as it were.
I would say that's a pretty fair assessment. The California, the people that go to California to fulfill that dream are going with a vision of becoming big-time capitalists.
Mm-hmm.
And the novel revolves around a group of New Englanders who form a company in January of 1849 that will take them onto a ship. They put up $100 a piece or $200 a piece, and these companies were formed here in New England in those early months of 1849 because they felt that if they all worked together, they would all get rich. They'd put up $100, $200 for tools, food, provisions, and for a ship, and they'd go 18,000 miles from Boston or New York down and around the Horn and all the way back up and into San Francisco Bay, where they would stop in San Francisco, which had to be an absolutely amazing place to see in those first years of the gold rush, because it's basically a massive tent city rising up onto Nob Hill. And there are all of these ships that have dropped anchor. Many of them are already abandoned because the crews would leave. The crews would desert. They said, we didn't sail 18,000 miles just to turn around and sail back. There's gold 100 miles away. See you later. And they would desert. And that's, of course, part of the story in the novel. Everybody gets gold fever. Everybody wants to be rich.
So this was sort of the West Coast equivalent of what the Industrial Revolution did to the East Coast, in a way, right? It modernized that area.
Because California, in 1848, because gold was found in January of 1848, in that year, California was inhabited by about 10,000 Europeans, or people of European ancestry, including the people who had come up to govern from Mexico. Within 2 years, there were 150,000. Within 3 years, there were 250,000 people there. And they had all come to fill that landscape and to find that gold, and they mined for it by crouching along the edges of rivers and swirling pans, and they found it by digging mines, and they found it by washing away hillsides. And slowly but surely, the powers of capital-intensive mining operations overwhelmed everything else, so that by the middle of the 1850s, the romance that I try to capture, that sense of an individual man going out to make his fate and make his fortune, that faded, and it became high-powered, high-money capitalism that was the gold rush eventually.
Now
But this isn't a social tract. You know, anybody out there who's read my novels knows that it's a big story on a broad canvas with lots of characters and lots of adventure and lots of satisfaction as well.
a lot of action.
Yep.
Bit of violence, quite a bit of violence.
Yes, well, it was a violent world.
Yes, and But in the book, Peter and Evangeline are drawn into this sort of dangerous
Right.
international mystery. And we get into the historical story through them. They go to modern San Francisco,
Yes.
and they find that the key to unraveling this mystery they've fallen into lies in these finding and reading these lost journals of one of these proper Bostonians who sailed and joined the gold rush.
Well, there are two main characters in the historical section, and I would say that they kind of mimic the two aspects of my personality. When I first came up with this story, it was 1974. We had gotten to California. I was taking a screenwriting course, and I said, I want to write about the gold rush. All of the people that I know around me are just like those people who came to California 130 years ago in order to make their way, make their fortune. We all have stars in our eyes. And so I was working from that awareness of these impulses being in myself and in my friends. And I created that young Bostonian who is going to California to write about the experience. And history gives you today an enormous number of diaries and journals about the gold rush that were written by these kinds of callow young men who said, we don't really need the money. These were usually children of privilege anyway. We don't really need the money, but we want that last great experience before we settle down to a life in our father's counting house. We want to see the elephant. That was the expression. So you have characters like him, and I would say that my Harvard experience sort of introduced me to that kind of world. And then you have the cynical Irishman who comes along and says, all of you Bostonians who have treated me badly here as an Irish potato famine refugee, you're going to find out. I'm going to pack up and go to California and make a lot of money, and then I'm going to come back and buy that club, that gentleman's club where the book begins. And that was sort of like the experience that I had on the other end of the red line. The other end of my youthful experience was as a card-carrying member of the International Laborers and General Construction Workers Union, Local 469 in South Boston. And I got to know a lot of Irish guys there. And so I put those two characters together, and this is what I think good storytelling is all about. You take interesting, disparate characters, you put them together in a situation unlike anything they've ever experienced before, and two guys on horseback going across the Central Valley of California, heading up into the mountains. That's an experience that none of them had ever experienced before, and then you see what happens with them.
Okay. So you decided to take Peter to the West Coast.
Right.
Mainly
so
from
Peter,
the idea of that screenplay.
Right. For those who haven't read my books, and when I'm on Cape Cod, I know that there are as many people who have as who haven't, I'm happy to say. Yes. The chapters in many of these historical novels alternate between past and present. You have in Back Bay, Harvard Yard, The Lincoln Letter, or Bound for Gold, you have Peter Fallon and Evangeline Carrington going off to find a lost artifact in some interesting place. And then in the historical sections, you see the story of the artifact as it passes through time. And in this case, you have Peter going to help his son, reconstitute the journal that was written by that young Bostonian. And so you get this first-person narrative from this young Bostonian about himself and his perceptions of the world, and about that Irish guy who becomes his closest friend. And meanwhile, Peter and Evangeline are in a kind of a suspense thriller. They're being chased all over San Francisco, up and down the hills, on the cable cars, and so forth and so on. And I think that the readers who like my books always come to them for that sense of the two worlds, the past and the present. Because what Peter and Evangeline do in their story is become the living embodiment for the reader of how important history still is to us. You might think, oh, whatever happened in 1849 is kind of dry and boring and doesn't really matter to us today. But Peter and Evangeline are being chased through the streets of San Francisco because they're trying to find out what happened in 1849. And it almost says to you as a reader, see, the history really does matter.
Right.
You know, the decisions of our ancestors.
Right.
From,
It's a little bit of Santayana.
right.
Because you see that history does replay itself in different ways, perhaps, but there are similarities. Indeed. In fact,
it echoes.
Yeah,
history
it echoes.
to us.
Right.
And I think that that's a fair thing.
In fact,
to
even
say.
though you said this is not a social tract,
Right.
I mean, I was struck by the fact that the historical story touches on some of really the hottest controversies of today.
That's true.
Particularly things like immigration and racism and the treatment of women.
Mm-hmm.
You have characters say things like, quote, "America for Americans, that's our motto." And quote, "always blame the immigrants, a story as old as humans."
Yeah.
And then a woman, I don't want to
You don't want to
give
give
a
too much
spoiler,
away.
but a woman delivers, after being raped, delivers a monologue that mirrors newspaper articles we've been reading this week with the Supreme Court hearing.
Yeah.
I mean, was that your intention, or is that just a fallout of the research, or?
Well, when I first started working on this screenplay in 1974, naturally I was looking for some significant conflict that I could create or write about in the gold country. Can't just have a bunch of guys go out there and they go here and they go there, you know. Then it's no longer a story, it's just a bunch of guys riding around.
Dry history.
And so what I wanted was some event that would galvanize these characters and force them to confront who they are. And what I discovered in my research way back in the 70s was that while California and the people who built California had very high intentions, they created self-government in the mining camps themselves in order to determine who could mine, how large a claim, and so forth. And they also had a constitutional convention. They applied for statehood in 1849 or early 1850. Statehood was granted more quickly in California than anywhere else in the Union. But one of the first laws that they brought forward, because they were trying to figure out how to pay for their new state government, was a foreign miners tax. If you were Chinese or Mexican or Chilean, if you came from anywhere outside of the original states at that point, you were going to be subject to a $20 a month tax. Now, that would be tantamount to about a $500 tax today, every single month. And when I saw that, when I was 24 years old, I said, this is wrong. This is the place that I focus on in the screenplay. And so naturally, when I came back to this novel a few years ago, I was really, I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised, but I guess that I was, to find that the wheel of American history was turning, and sometimes it rolls over the same ground again and again. And so it's very important to me that as readers we hear the echoes of history when I bring that history to life to you, because the history is telling us in a lot of ways how we got to where we are, and exploring the matters, the issues of race that are endemic to the California Gold Rush and to the whole American story. I think that I'm doing something important for the readers that want to understand not only the grand visions of how we got to where we are today, but also who want to look into the dark corners too, because that's really the only way to fully come to grips with who we are and with where we want to go next.
Right. Interesting that this started so long ago with that screenplay.
Yeah.
I'm curious. you say in your acknowledgments that the names Spencer and Flynn of your two protagonists
Yeah.
are the same.
Yes.
How many other similarities lived 40 years later?
Oh, well, when I finished that screenplay, which, by the way, won the Hal Wallace Screenwriting Fellowship in 1974, I got my name on the cover of Variety. I got $2,500. It was the first time
Pretty
that
good.
it was the first time that anybody other than my wife ever called me a writer. And I got to meet the famous Hal Wallace, who had produced Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy,
Right.
all those John Wayne movies. Well, when that screenplay was finished, I looked at it and I said, you know, there's a whole third act here. These characters haven't finished living their lives. And as a writer, you're always wondering what came after the characters walked off stage. And I carried in my head the vision of what that third act would be all about. And so when you read it, you'll almost know where the third act of the story begins, when the characters head for San Francisco and get involved in the building of the city itself and the rise of the vigilantes and so forth. But most of the characters, most of the incidents they survived 40 years in the first 2/3 of the historical sections of the story. That stuff survived. Now, there are three main characters in the historical section. There's Spencer, there's Flynn, and there's the old miner named Cletus. And when I was a young guy, I wrote the screenplay carrying certain movie actors in my mind. And I had envisioned Robert Redford as Spencer, and Jack Nicholson doing an Irish accent as Flynn, and James Stewart as the old miner, because he was still alive at the time. And I suspect that now, I'm not sure if it should ever happen.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, how did your research lead you to real people that sort of turned into parts or all of characters in this book?
Well, that's something that all good research should be suggesting to you: historical characters who can carry a certain amount of the narrative, but also giving you a sense of how you can draw out of the history fictional characters who will be interesting and alive. And in this case, these characters are based upon wide ranges of young men that I read about, many of them all but nameless, even in the history books. The diarists and the letter writers who communicated home from California about how unhappy they were and how miserable the weather was, because it was a very rainy winter in 1849. So I would draw upon all of these things in order to create, in these characters, fictional amalgamations of history.
Okay.
Yeah, and there is a mining company in the book called the Sagamore Mining Company, and
Speaking of Cape Cod.
right, and they are modeled after a mining company that actually existed, the California and Boston Joint Stock and Mining Company, which was a bunch of guys from Harvard who named their ship after Harvard's president, the Edward Everett, and he gave them all Bibles as they went onto the ship. And there were 144 of these companies that got organized in New England in the first months of 1849. Those guys got on a ship. They were charged with not only finding gold, but bringing their vision of New England society to the far shores of the Pacific. And the ship traveled all the way around the Horn, then traveled up the San Joaquin River to Stockton. They all got off the ship, and they hated each other by this point. They had been together for 6 or 8 months, and they all went on their own. and they sold all of their provisions for about half of what they had paid for them in Boston. And to lose money on provisions in California in 1849, it had to be a pretty bad business
Yes,
deal that you were making.
Because at one point
Yeah.
you're talking about selling shovels for
The shovels went.
$50,
Right, right.
equivalent of $1,600.
That's
today.
right.
Wow.
That is absolutely right.
Wow.
And of course, that becomes a significant aspect of the novel. One of the things that California history during the gold rush reveals is that it's sometimes smarter to be the ones who are selling things that people need rather than the people themselves. So that, for example, there was a guy named Sam Brannan who, when he first got wind of the fact that gold had been discovered, went around and bought up every shovel, pick, and pan in all of Northern California and put them in his own store in Sacramento. And then he went to San Francisco and announced that gold had been discovered. And he sold all those shovels, picks, and pans for enormous profit. And it was the people who mined the miners, as they say, who sold the drinks and played cards and sold the other things that the miners needed, who really made the money, the businessmen.
I have a guess, but who was your favorite character?
That would be like saying, who's my favorite kid? I never say that. I think most
In the book, in this book,
most-
not overall.
most people are they love Michael Flynn,
Yeah, that's who I was
the
gonna
Irish
guess, yeah.
character in the historical section, and they always like Peter and Evangeline.
Well, we only have about a minute.
Okay.
So, quickly, what's your next project?
I am writing a book now that the working title is December 41, begins the day after Pearl Harbor and ends on Christmas Eve, 1941. I ain't telling you nothing more about it, except that no, it's not a Peter Fallon novel. It's
not.
It's a World War II thriller. And I've always wanted to write one, and I think you will be up late turning pages, just as you will be with Bound for Gold when you sit down to read it.
And I will tell our viewers that I agree. I think you will enjoy this, this wonderful novel. It's a good, easy read, but it's very informative. Again, the book is Bound for Gold. It's published by Forge and is available in most bookstores and
Yes, it is.
Amazon.
And remember what Hawthorne once said, easy reading is damned hard writing.
It
That's
absolutely
right.
is. It absolutely is.
You can find it in any of the great independent bookstores all around Cape Cod or almost any place else you'd look.
William Martin, thank you for your time, and we really look forward to that next work. And thank you for viewers for joining us again on Books in the World. See you next time.